Okay, so a lot has happened. We're gonna have to briskly jog through some of the smaller stuff to get to the big stuff, but before we do that, make sure to like, subscribe, and blah blah blah. After 8 years of conflict, the Throne World Minecraft server was finally at peace, but then a player called BlytheShave3 ruined all of that. If you haven't watched our previous video, you should probably go do that. But to summarize, Blythe caused boom, and then Skipper went to pow. After the First Blithic War ended in Blythe's defeat, Skipper's two best players, SeaMonkey 101574 and Dino 2891XX, left to create their own faction. They chose to move just north of the Empire's territory, establishing the Celtic Comrades faction. The newly rebranded Eternal Empire was not too happy about this. Throughout their history, the former Raging Wizards had enjoyed complete dominion over their side of the server. If there was unrest in Akamond, no problem. If the empires in the east started killing each other, no worries. If a massive horde of pillagers, the likes of which have never been seen in all of Minecraft history, started to invade from the north, destroying everything in their path until nothing was left was on its way, no sweat. Everything had always been several hundred blocks away. Now, all of that could change. However, before the tension between the two neighbors could even start to rise, Blythe came back, albeit for a very short time. After the killing of Dino's horse, the Celtic Comrades immediately declared war on Blythe's Dark Knight faction. In response, the Knights completely destroyed their castle, believing the Celts to be most responsible for Blythe's defeat in the First Blithic War. Despite all this chaos on their border, the Eternals figured it wasn't worth going to war for a stupid horse, so they remained neutral. After the final defeat of the Dark Knights, a lot of things happened on the server. The tropical kingdom of Khufu changed locations from a peninsula to an island. Epic Bob 24 handed over control of the HOJ to a player called Turbo Red Fox, and the Eternal Empire recovered most of its lost land. Alright, now with all of that out of the way, let's talk about the Celtics. Led by SeaMonkey 101574, the Celtic Comrades faction was the most populous faction on the server, with over 10 members in its ranks. This was terrible news for the Eternal Empire. Not only did it have to share the Western Hemisphere with another faction, but it had to do so as the potentially weaker neighbor. The Eternals were certain that if their plan for server domination was to be achieved, this arrangement had to change. The Celts, however, seemed blissfully aware of their predicament, even gifting the Emperor himself with diamonds galore on many occasions. He had seen many ruses before this, though, and in his opinion, the Celtics' very friendly behavior seemed extremely suspicious. Construction immediately began on a small base west of Imperial Center, positioned just 300 blocks south of the Celtic castle. It was close enough for the siege cannons to reach the enemy fortress, but far enough away to avoid detection. The plan, referred to as Operation Northern Storm, was simple. After declaring war, the Eternals would launch several salvos at the castle, demoralizing the Celtics and shattering the massive walls protecting them. Then, they would launch a whole squadron of bombers to lay waste to any Celtic players coming to attack, and cause further damage to those who remained in the castle. Finally, the Eternals and their mercenaries would descend from all sides to finish off the disoriented and disorganized Celts. This plan, while well thought out, would never be implemented. On the day that war was supposed to be declared, the Eternal Empire came under attack. Building after building was attacked, bombed, and destroyed in what would be called the Anonymous Raids. The attacks were so extensive that even the Imperial Navy couldn't escape. During the attacks, the Imperial battleships Tirpitz and Victory were disabled by explosions concentrated on their main siege cannons. For some reason, they completely skipped over the aircraft carriers, but who cares? 2 out of 4 is good enough. The Celtics immediately offered their help, which Skipper accepted. However, upon rejoining the server after having left to consult the members of the server Discord, which you should totally join by the way, Skipper found even more buildings demolished. Now, whether the Celtics actually bombed the crap out of the Eternal Empire remains a mystery to this day. But is it so hard to see why Skipper thought this whole thing was a tad bit shady? I don't think so. After surveying the newly leveled buildings, Skipper declared war on the Celtic Comrades. The Celts begged Skipper to reconsider, insisting that they were a weak faction. According to CM, most of the Celtic members had left the faction, leaving only 3 active members to fight against the Eternals. This only motivated Skipper more though. In his mind, revenge would be extracted from a powerful enemy or from a weak one. So, before we get to the war, let's cover how war on the Throne World Minecraft server actually works. When war is declared on your faction, you have 2 full days to prepare. You cannot attack or be attacked during those 2 days, and you are also forbidden from leaving your declared territory. Finally, During the conflict, the majority of your players must remain on the server. Any violations of these rules will result in an automatic loss. As the 48-hour prepping period came to an end, the two armies readied for battle. However, things were already starting to go wrong for the Eternals. The Aberram mercenaries Skipper had hired failed to show up, forcing the player SS-102 to fill in for them. Additionally, very few of his own members showed up to fight, leaving him with a fraction of the force he had hoped to muster. Unfortunately for Skipper, these were mere inconveniences compared to what was about to come next. Remember that castle we talked about earlier? Well, as it turns out, the Celts had secretly moved their base about 400 blocks to the east to a well-hidden bunker just 100 blocks from the Eternal Empire's northern border. Once the Eternals noticed this, they scrambled to set up a defense. As the prep time clock counted down to 0, the war began. As the battle commenced, the Eternals rushed to implement a revised version of Northern Storm. Despite their more limited numbers, Skipper still believed the Eternals held the advantage. If the Celts hunkered down, they could still be annihilated by the Eternals' long-range bombers and cannons. However, this new plan was predicated on one massive assumption: the belief that the Celtics would wait for the Eternals to strike first. The Celtics charged in head first, using potions of invisibility and strength to bolster their attacks. Their ferocity stunned the unprepared Eternals and knocked them off balance. As the Eternals attempted to regain their lost ground, the inability to see their enemy take any damage began to demoralize them, and they were pushed back, again and again, eventually being forced out of the entire region. After failing to hold the northern border, Skipper decided to take the fight to the enemy's castle. Skipper hoped that by the time the Celts reached his army, the invisibility potions will have worn off and the Eternals could possibly force the Celts to surrender in exchange for their base. After reaching the fortress, the Eternals began to fire salvo after salvo upon the castle walls, hoping this would bring the Celts to the negotiating table. The Celtics, however, were uninterested. What's that? The Celts are here, sooner than expected. Oh, and look at that, their invisibility potions are still active. Like in the previous battle, the Eternals were unable to hold the castle and soon retreated from the battle. Spurred on by their successes, the Celts pressed their advantage, pushing the Eternals all the way back to Imperial Center. Then, they laid siege to the city, bombing Imperial Center's towering structures indiscriminately. So that's it, right? The Celtics are breaking through the walls, they're bombing the kinda sus hotel, and Sea Monkey is about to hand the Eternals their first big L. It's all over. You, my friend, would be forgiven if you thought this was where the war was going to end. After all, it's where they thought the war was going to end too. Even the mercenary Triple S suggested to Skipper that a truce may be the only favorable way to end the conflict. One thing that everyone was forgetting was the fact that the Eternal Empire had existed for years, with colonies spanning the entire map. This wasn't the first time Imperial Center had been attacked. Ultimately, a few blown-up buildings could be replaced. The resources the Celts were expending to blow up these buildings, however, could not. Unbeknownst to them, the Celts had pushed their undersupplied enemy all the way back to their most major supply line, Imperial Center itself. As the Celts wasted energy and resources bombing the city, the Eternals were able to resupply and rearm. Once they had enough materials, the Eternals made their assault. Fighting began to heat up in the middle of the city as the startled Celts put up a fierce resistance against the Eternal counterattack. Eventually, a large crater began to form as TNT blasts broke into the underground railroad tunnels running throughout the city. The battle was finally won when one player, hero of the Pillager War Veermammal 56, was able to single-handedly kill every single Celtic player in the area. This battle marked a turning point in the war. Retaking their lost momentum, the revitalized Eternals began picking off the exhausted Celts, forcing them to retreat from the city. From there, the Celtics began a long, disorganized retreat home, harassed along the way by mercenaries as they fled through the snow. Now, it was Skipper's turn to attack the enemy homeland. The Eternals launched bombers across the Celtic countryside, hoping to knock out any bunkers hidden under the grass. One by one, the Celtic players began to lose hope and fled the server. The few that remained were chased all the way back to their underground bunker north of the border. After a destructive bombing run, the player Triple S was able to locate the entrance to this bunker. Within a matter of minutes, the Eternal mercenary force stormed the base, plundering whatever was of value, and then destroying the entire structure. The war was finally over. After surrendering, the Celtics were stripped of their elytra and were sent into exile. They would remain homeless for a whole month before settling on the large continent of Egress. just south of the newly founded Grand Dragon Empire. There they would begin to build a new castle and once again take their place as one of the Throne World's most powerful factions. The Imperial territory would expand further to encompass all of the Celtics' former possessions. Eventually, all lands east of the Rio Aegis would fall under the Eternal Flag. Now, Skipper's faction could sit securely as there were no more threats to his rule. After all, it was rather unlikely that the factions of the server were soon to become super interconnected with and financially reliant on each other. It's also not feasible that a certain terrorist would soon return to threaten world peace. And it's also most assuredly not probable that remnants from a previous global conflict were about to reassemble themselves and cause the greatest widespread conflict the server had ever seen. That would just be ridiculous.